A 10-year-old getting pregnant has thrown the whole family into panic. They couldn't find out who the father was, but on the day of the birth, the doctors found something unexpected. What really happened will leave you stunned. Emily and Michael were the kind of parents who lived for their daughter, Ella. Just 10 years old, she was the center of their world. Together they were the perfect little family, always going on adventures, making memories and enjoying every second of it. Michael loved taking them out on weekends, whether it was the movies or a trip to the fair. Emily made sure they always had something special to look forward to. She was big on family time. Ella thrived in that environment, a bright, bubbly child. She was the kind of girl everyone noticed for her good nature. Teachers loved her, friends adored her, and at home, she was the heart of the household. She could make anyone smile with her endless energy, her chatter filling every room with life. That girl could talk till the cows come home, Michael would joke, often with a grin, as Ella would rattle off a million stories before finally drifting off to sleep. Yet, happiness, it seemed, was not meant to last. It started out small. A little complaint here, a stomach ache there. "It's probably just something you ate," Emily said one evening when Ella mentioned feeling unwell after dinner. "A little rest and you'll be good as new by morning." Only, Ella didn't feel better by morning. In fact, over the next few days, things seemed to worsen. She became quieter, a strange shift for a girl who never stopped talking. By the end of the week, Emily noticed Ella seemed to be holding her stomach more often, wincing. Occasionally one morning as Emily helped her get dressed, she saw it. A slight bulge, round and hard, sticking out from her daughter's stomach. Her heart skipped a beat. "What is this?" she whispered, almost afraid of the answer. Ella shrugged, clearly just as confused as her mother. "Does it hurt?" Emily asked, her voice more urgent now. "How long has this been here?" "A few weeks," Ella mumbled, looking down, unsure. Emily's mind raced. It couldn't be what she thought. No, it had to be something else. An infection, a cyst, something benign. She called Michael into the room, her voice shaking, and when he saw it, his face turned pale. "We're going to the hospital," he said firmly, grabbing his keys without a second thought. Ella, usually so spirited and talkative, said nothing during the ride. The air in the car was thick with tension, every mile feeling like a lifetime as they made their way to the hospital. Emily's hands shook as she held onto her daughter, silently praying this was all just a misunderstanding. Once there, the nurses took them in quickly. Ella was examined and tests were ordered. Emily and Michael sat in the waiting room, their minds racing with possibilities, none of them good. It felt like forever before the doctor came back, his face unreadable. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news," he started, his voice low and steady. Emily's heart sank. She reached for Michael's hand, gripping it tight as the doctor continued. "Your daughter, Ella, she's pregnant." Time stopped. Emily blinked, trying to process what she had just heard. Pregnant. The word felt wrong in her mouth, impossible, absurd. Michael's face went white, his knuckles turning pale as he gripped the armrest of the chair. "That's impossible," he stammered, his voice cracking with disbelief. "She's 10, she's just a child, how could—" "I know this is hard to understand," the doctor interrupted, choosing his words carefully, "but the tests are conclusive. Ella is several months along." "No," Emily whispered, shaking her head, tears blurring her vision. "There's been a mistake. This can't be." But the doctor just looked at her with that same solemn expression, the kind you'd expect when delivering bad news. Emily felt like the world was spinning. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her daughter, her sweet, innocent little girl, was pregnant. How could this happen? Who did this? A dozen questions flooded her mind, none of them with answers she wanted to face. Michael stood suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the tile floor. His face was contorted with anger, disbelief, and fear. "Who?" he demanded, his voice shaking but filled with rage. "Who did this to her?" "We don't know yet," the doctor said carefully. "It's important we focus on Ella's health for now." No, Michael growled, his voice rising. We need to know who's responsible. Someone hurt my daughter, and I want to know who. Emily was too numb to speak. Her world had collapsed around her in an instant. The laughter, the joy, the plans for the future, all gone in a blink. I need to be with her, Emily finally managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. The doctor nodded, leading her into the room where Ella lay, oblivious to the storm she had just set off in her parents' lives. She looked up as Emily entered, her small face pale but calm. Am I going to be okay, Mum? Emily felt the tears well up in her eyes. Yes, sweetheart, she whispered, forcing a smile. We're going to figure this out, I promise. But deep down, Emily knew nothing would ever be the same again. Emily and Michael were restless days had turned into weeks, and they were no closer to understanding the unimaginable reality that had taken hold of their lives. Their daughter, Ella, 10 years old and still so full of innocence, was pregnant. Michael, once the composed father, with a quick smile and a gentle demeanour, now seethed with a quiet but unrelenting anger. It festered deep within him. And every time he looked at Ella, still acting as though the world hadn't changed, it tore at his heart. She played with her toys, chatted away as if nothing was wrong. There was no shame, no sore sorrow in her, just the pure confusion of a child who didn't understand the storm brewing around her. Michael would stand there, his fists clenched, his heart aching. Emily, on the other hand, felt hollowed out by grief. She blamed herself over and over again for not seeing the signs, for not protecting Ella from whatever horror had befallen her. Her mind raced through endless scenarios, wondering what moment of carelessness had allowed this unspeakable tragedy to happen at night, when the house was quiet and Michael sat brooding in the next room. Emily would quietly cry, the tears soaking her pillow, every part of her HAD for the little girl who had been robbed of her childhood. Yet through all the pain, one thing remained. They were determined to find out the truth. The investigation began. Though it wasn't official, not yet. Emily and Michael started with the men Ella had come into contact with, the familiar faces of their neighbourhood, the teachers at her school, the bus driver who smiled too wide. No one seemed trustworthy anymore. Michael made a list of every man Ella could have known. He brought up names, places, dates, the friendly school custodian, the cheerful gym teacher who always gave her extra time in PE, even the teenage boys who played basketball down the street, all of them. Michael thought there was a suspect who did this to you. Ella, Emily asked gently one evening as she sat beside her daughter, her voice barely holding back the quiver of desperation.
Ella, sitting cross-legged on her bed, looked up from the colouring book in her lap.
I don't know, Mommy, she said softly, her face scrunching up in confusion. Nobody did.
Anything. Emily's heart sank. The thought that someone had harmed her child, that someone had taken advantage of her innocence, was unbearable. Are you sure, baby? Did anyone touch you? Did anyone do something that made you feel uncomfortable or hurt?
Ella shook her head with an earnestness that left no room for doubt. No, Mummy, no one did anything, I promise.
Emily looked away, biting her lip to keep from crying. How could this be? How could her daughter, her sweet little girl, not?
Michael, standing in the doorway, could barely contain his rage. His patience was wearing thin. It wasn't that he didn't believe Ella. It was that her confusion only deepened the mystery, and he needed the truth no matter how.
A few painful days later, DNA tests were done on the baby. Michael had pushed for it, convinced it was the only way to uncover the truth. They tested every suspect on the list, the bus driver, the teachers, even a few neighbours. The tests came back negative, all of them. None of the men they suspected were the father.
Mother, how is that possible?
Michael muttered angrily, pacing in the kitchen.
It's like a ghost did this.
His voice was low but filled with a burning fury that Emily had never heard before. She sat at the kitchen table, hands trembling as she stared at the papers in front of her.
I don't know,
she whispered, her voice breaking. The investigation hit a wall. Days stretched into weeks. The mystery deepened, and so did Michael's frustration. Then, a small breakthrough came. It was the kind of moment that neither parent could have predicted, but ultimately reshaped their understanding of what had happened. It was an ordinary afternoon at home. Emily had stepped out to run some errands, and Michael was in the living room reading through a pile of bills, his mind barely present.
Ella, what are you doing with your dolls?
They're playing a game.
What kind of game?
It's the game I play with Ethan. The dolls are pretending to be me and Ethan.
What do you mean, Ella? What kind of game do you play with Ethan?
We play like this.
The positioning of the dolls left no room for misinterpretation. This is it, he thought, the realization hitting him like a sledgehammer. Ethan. It wasn't some adult, some stranger, some predator lurking in the shadows. It was Ethan, the boy next door. Everything inside Michael shattered in that moment. He didn't even pause to think. Rage overtook him like a tidal wave, and before he knew it, he was on his feet, storming out of the house. His mind was a blur of fury and disbelief.
What did your son do to my daughter?
What are you talking about, Michael? What?
Ethan. Ella told me, She showed me what they did. You think I'm going to let this go? He shoved David again, harder this time. Your son is going to answer for this. David's wife rushed to the door, her face pale with confusion and fear. What's going on? Michael's rage blinded him. He couldn't hear, her couldn't think straight. All he could see was the image of his daughter, the dolls in her hands. The innocence in her eyes. He was losing control, and nothing could stop him. David's voice trembled as he tried to explain, but Michael wasn't hearing him. The words barely formed on David's lips, and already Michael was bearing down on him with an intensity that bordered on feral rage, poured out of him in waves, making his every movement sharp, dangerous. Your son did this to my daughter. Michael roared, the veins in his neck bulging. He shoved David harder against the doorframe, the sound of the impact echoing through the otherwise quiet neighborhood. David's wife Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face pale and bewildered. What's happening, Michael? What's going on? Her voice wavered on the verge of panic. Michael didn't answer. He couldn't. He was too far gone, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm of anger and despair. His hands were clenched so tight around David's collar that his knuckles were white in the back of his mind. He heard Emily's voice begging him to stop, but even that was a distant, muffled sound. David managed to stammer, Michael, please, there's got to be some mistake, Ethan. He's just a boy. He couldn't have done this. He doesn't even understand what... Don't. Michael's voice cracked as he cut David off, shaking him by the collar. Don't you dare tell me he didn't know what he was doing. Ella told us, David, she showed us your son might be the father of her child. The words were like fire burning in his throat. And the more he spoke, the hotter that fire became. His chest heaved, his breath ragged. Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with shock. No, that can't be right. She murmured, her voice barely audible. Ethan, he's just a child, just like Ella. There's no way you think we want this to be true. Michael shot back, his voice sharp with bitterness. We don't know for sure yet, but your boy, he's the only one Ella talked about. You better hope we're wrong. His face twisted with frustration as he let go of David, his fists still trembling before anyone could say more. Emily hurried down the street, her face flushed with worry. She'd been out running errands when her phone buzzed with a frantic message from a neighbor who had seen Michael's store wearing toward the Ethan's house. When she arrived and saw her husband and David almost at blows, her heart sank. Stop it, she shouted, rushing between the two men. Michael, stop. She placed her hands on her husband's chest, trying to push him back. This isn't helping. We need to calm down. Emily. Michael growled through clenched teeth. They're trying to tell me that Ethan didn't know what he was doing. Sarah looked at Emily with desperation in her eyes. We don't even know if it's true, Emily. Ethan, he's only a child. There's no way he could have caused this. We don't know for sure. Emily took a deep breath, her voice trembling but determined. We don't know anything for sure yet. We're all just jumping to conclusions. Listen, there's only one way to really find out the truth. We need to take them for a DNA test. Both Ella and Ethan. There was a pause. Sarah and David exchanged a look. The color draining from their faces, the thought of Ethan being tested, of having the undeniable truth revealed, terrified them. But what other choice did they have? David finally spoke, his voice low and strained. Fine. We'll do the test, but if it comes back negative, Michael, you'll owe us an apology. Michael didn't answer, the anger in his eyes still blazing. And if it comes back positive, David, I'm not sure an apology will cover what's coming. A few days later, the results were ready. The room felt cold, sterile, as both families sat in tense silence at the clinic. Ella and Ethan were seated on either side of the room, neither fully understanding the weight of what was happening. Ella stared down at her shoes, her fingers fidgeting nervously while Ethan's hands were clenched into tight fists in his lap. His gaze fixed on the floor, the doctor entered, a solemn expression on her face. Holding the results in her hand, she cleared her throat, and the tension in the room thickened. I've reviewed the tests, she began, her voice calm but serious. The DNA confirms that Ethan is indeed the father of Ella's baby. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she turned to look at her son, who remained still, his face pale. David slumped in his seat, his shoulders sagging with the weight of the news. Michael's fists tightened at his sides, his face flushed with a mix of fury and disbelief. Emily, sitting beside him, pressed a hand to her mouth, her body trembling. The confirmation felt like a punch to the gut. It wasn't speculation anymore. It wasn't just a possibility. It was the truth. I can't believe it, Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. Ethan, how could this happen? David shook his head, his voice cracking as he spoke. He's just a boy. He didn't know, he didn't mean to, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Michael stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Your son did this to our daughter, whether
He meant to or not, he's still responsible. You are responsible.
His voice was rising again, and Emily placed a hand on his arm, trying to calm him.
Michael, please. We need to figure out what to do next. There's no going back now. We can't change what's happened.
Figure out what to do next. They should have been watching their son. They let this happen, and now Ella's life is ruined. Ruined.
Our son is involved too. He didn't do this alone. You act like Ethan is the only one who made a mistake.
It's your fault for not watching him closely. If you had raised him better, none of this would have happened. Now look where we are.
The tension in the room exploded.
You think we wanted this? You think we haven't been asking ourselves how this happened? How we didn't see it? This is our nightmare too.
Both families were now caught in a storm of blame and accusations. Words flew between them like sharp knives, each cutting deeper into the fragile fabric of their relationships. The room seemed smaller, suffocating under the weight of the anger, fear, and guilt. Meanwhile, Ella and Ethan sat in the corner, caught in the middle of the chaos. They were too young to understand the gravity of what was happening, but they could feel the tension, the hostility in the air. Ella hugged her knees to her chest, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She could hear her parents shouting, could see the angry faces of Ethan's parents, and she felt something heavy settle in her chest. She didn't fully understand what was going on, but she knew deep down that it was because of... Her voice trembled as she whispered to Ethan, Did we do something, Dad?
Ethan didn't answer right away. He stared down at his hands, his face pale and frightened. I don't know, he muttered. I didn't think we did.
Ella's heart sank. The guilt was creeping in, wrapping itself around her, suffocating her. She couldn't shake the feeling that all of this, the shouting, the anger, the pain, was her fault. She hadn't meant for any of this to happen. She didn't even understand what had happened. But now everything seemed broken, and she was at the center of it.
They're fighting because of us, Ella whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. Because of what we did.
Ethan stayed silent, but the guilt in his eyes mirrored Ella's own. Both children sat in the corner, their small bodies curled inwards as if trying to make themselves disappear amidst the chaos of the adults. The day everyone had been dreading finally arrived. The weight of it hung over the hospital like a storm cloud. The bright, sterile lights, the beeping machines, and the hurried steps of the medical staff seemed distant to Michael and Emily, who sat in the waiting room, barely breathing. Their world had shrunk down to this one moment, this one room, where their 10-year-old daughter was about to give birth.
Michael sat hunched over, his elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. He hadn't spoken in hours, not since the doctors had whisked Ella away.
Emily sat beside him, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her coat. She kept glancing at the door to the delivery room, as if willing it to open, as if hoping that somehow everything would just stop.
The tension was unbearable. Though they were still furious with Ethan's family, even David and Sarah sat in their own corner of the waiting room, silent and pale. The rage that had consumed them all only days before had given way to something far darker, fear. A fear so tangible, so oppressive, that it made the air thick and suffocating. They were no longer two families at war. In that moment they were simply parents, terrified of losing their children. Minutes turned into hours. And then a doctor, her face tight with concern, emerged from the delivery room. She walked toward them, her steps deliberate, her expression solemn.
"I need to speak with you both," she said, her voice calm but grave.
Michael looked up, his face hollow, while Emily's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with panic. They stood up slowly, exchanging a glance that conveyed their worst fears.
"Is she okay?" Emily asked, her voice breaking.
The doctor hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough for Michael to feel the weight of the world drop onto his shoulders.
"Ella is experiencing complications," the doctor said gently. "Her body is too small for this process. Her blood pressure is dropping, and we're struggling to keep her stable."
Michael's knees buckled, and Emily grabbed his arm for support. The room spun. It felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath their feet.
"How bad is it?" Michael asked, his voice a rough whisper.
The doctor took a deep breath.
"There's a 50-50 chance, Mr. and Mrs. Emily. We're doing everything we can, but her condition is critical. We need to move quickly."
Emily's heart shattered at those words, the pieces falling into a pit of hopelessness. She quote, "He's just a child," she whispered more to herself than to anyone else. "She's too young for this. This shouldn't be happening." Michael clenched his fists, trying to find some anchor, some way to steady. The roaring storm inside him. He couldn't lose Ella. He couldn't lose his little girl. The doctor nodded with a sympathetic glance. "I know this is hard to hear, but we're doing everything we can. We'll keep you updated as soon as we have more information." As the doctor turned and walked back into the delivery room, the weight of the situation pressed down on them. All silence filled the waiting area again, but it was no longer the tense, bitter silence of two families in conflict. It was the silence of shared fear. Sarah's voice broke through the stillness. "Is this because of us?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because of Ethan?" Her eyes searched David's for an answer, but he had none to give. He just shook his head, tears brimming in his eyes. Michael couldn't take it anymore. He stood and paced his hands, trembling with both anger and helplessness. How had it come to this? His daughter's life was hanging by a thread because of a situation that should never have happened. But the anger had no target. Now it had all melted away, leaving only fear, confusion, and sorrow. Suddenly, the waiting room door swung open again, and Ethan, standing in the doorway, his eyes wide with terror, rushed in. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he bolted into the hospital, running past the waiting families. His heart pounded so hard, it felt like it might burst through his chest. He had overheard David and Sarah talking to the doctors. Heard them say that Ella might not make it, that she was in danger without thinking. Without stopping to ask permission, he ran down the corridor toward the delivery room. He wasn't sure what he would do, but all he knew was that he had to be there. He had to see her. Ethan David's voice rang out as he chased after his son, but the boy didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The nurse standing by the door tried to block him, her arms outstretched. "You can't go in there," she said firmly. "It's not safe." But Ethan dodged past her, small and fast, slipping through the door. Before she could stop him, he found himself in the harsh, bright lights of the delivery room. Machines beeped. Doctors moved urgently, and in the middle of it all was Ella, lying so still on the bed, pale and fragile. Her small body was hooked up to tubes and wires, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Ethan's heart broke at the sight. He had never seen her like this, so vulnerable, so close to the edge. Tears welled in his eyes, As he rushed to her side, grabbing her hand, holding it tightly between his own, he didn't care about the doctors, the nurses, or the chaos around him. He only cared about Ella. "Ella," he whispered, his voice cracking as the tears spilled down his cheeks. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't know it would get this bad." His words were choked with emotion. He squeezed her hand tighter, pressing it to his chest, as if trying to keep her connected to him, to keep her from slipping away. "Please don't leave, don't go. I need you, we need you," the doctors were shouting, trying to pull him away, but Ethan wouldn't let go. He clung to Ella's hand, as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded in a world that was spinning out of control. "Ella, please," Ethan sobbed, "don't leave me for a moment." The room seemed to still, as if everything time, sound, life was holding its breath. The doctors exchanged worried glances, unsure of what to do, but something shifted in the air. Ella's hand twitched at first. It was barely noticeable, just a slight movement, but then her fingers tightened around, found Ethan's hand weak. But there the machines beeped louder as her heart rate picked up, and one of the nurses called out, "She's stabilizing." The doctors moved quickly, administering more care, their movements a blur around Ethan, but he didn't let go of Ella's hand. He couldn't. Her grip, though, faint was enough. It was hope. Outside the delivery room, both families stood frozen, watching through the small window. Emily, seeing her daughter's hand move, covered her mouth in disbelief. Tears spilling down her face. Even Michael, still tense with worry and anger, felt something break inside him, a sliver of hope fighting its way through the darkness. The minutes that followed felt like hours, but slowly Ella's condition improved. Her heart rate steadied, her breathing grew stronger, and the color returned to her face. The worst had passed. Eventually Ethan was gently led away from the room by a nurse, but not before he leaned down and whispered one last thing into Ella's ear. "I'm here. I'll always be here." As the doctors finished their work and Ella's conditions stabilized, both families stood outside the room, watching the miraculous turn of events unfold. There were no words, just the quiet understanding that something far greater than any of them had taken place in that room. Ethan's desperate plea, his unwavering hold on Ella's hand, had somehow brought her back from the brink. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no anger, no blame, no bitterness between the two families. There was only the fragile shared hope that Ella would be okay, and that maybe, just maybe, they could all start to heal. And then the faint cry of a newborn broke the silence. The doctor, with a warm but tired smile, wrapped the newborn boy in a blanket and handed him to the nurse, who gently brought him over to Ella's parents. For a moment neither spoke. They just stood there, staring at the life that had been brought into the world under such impossible circumstances. It was Michael who moved first, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the baby. Emily, watching her husband hold their grandson, the child's small face red and wrinkled. He was peaceful, unaware of the turmoil that had surrounded his birth. Sarah and David stood in the corner, silently watching, their faces pale with shock, but also with relief. Emily and Sarah made eye contact then, for the first time in what felt like forever, the hostility that had once been so sharp between them. The anger, the blame, all of it seemed to dissolve in that moment. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and before she could stop herself, she walked over to Emily. She hesitated, unsure if her gesture would be accepted. But then, as if some unspoken understanding passed between them, Emily opened her arms, and the two women embraced. Tears flowed freely. All the pain, all the confusion, and all the fear came pouring out. In that embrace, it wasn't about blame anymore. It wasn't about who was at fault or who had suffered more. It was about something much bigger than any of them.
"We have to let it go. For them."
Emily whispered through her tears. Sarah nodded, her own voice breaking, Michael still holding the baby.
This is bigger than any of us. We have to find a way to move forward for Ella, for Ethan, and for this little one.
We will.
Michael took a deep breath and nodded toward the baby. His voice was hoarse from the strain of the day. His eyes softened as he looked down at the child, now quiet and calm in his arms. David stepped forward, his hands shaking as he reached out to gently touch the baby's tiny hand. The two families, once so divided, stood side by side, now united in the face of the life that had just entered the world. The weight of their conflict, their anger and their blame melted away in the presence of the child who had unknowingly become the bridge between them. He had brought them all together in a way none of them had expected.
Oliver.
I think we should all be part of that decision.
It's a strong name, a name that means something.
Oliver it is, then.
Together the room fell silent for a moment. Naming the child suddenly felt like the first real step toward accepting this new chapter in their lives, toward accepting the responsibility they all shared. It wasn't just about Ella or Ethan anymore. It was about the boy they now all had a part in raising. Sarah, still standing beside Emily, smiled softly through her tears. Emily looked at the child in Michael's arms, then back at Sarah. David and Sarah exchanged a glance, nodding slowly. Michael smiled faintly, looking down at the baby. Two families shared a quiet, solemn moment as they agreed on the name. It wasn't just a name, it was a promise. A promise that Oliver would be raised with love, that he would be surrounded by both families, and that he would never have to bear the weight of his birth alone. Both families agreed that Ethan and Ella would continue to live their lives as children, not parents. Oliver would be raised by Emily and Michael, but Ethan and his family would be there every step of the way. It wasn't just about the baby anymore. It was about healing the two children who had been swept into something far beyond their understanding. Time passed slowly at first, like the quiet unfolding of dawn after a long, sleepless night. The weeks bled into months, and somehow, after all, the pain, confusion and fear, life began to find a rhythm again. The heavy burden of anger and blame that had once weighed so heavily on both families was slowly replaced by a fragile, tentative peace.
Michael and I became the primary caretakers of Oliver. Our home, once filled with the laughter and energy of our only daughter, now cradled the quiet breaths of a newborn.
At night, when the house was still, we would peek into the nursery and watch him sleep. His tiny chest rising and falling, a reminder of the fragility and strength of life.
Oliver was growing, his soft features. The bond of family was becoming stronger with each passing day.
Mommy, why does Oliver sleep so much?
Innocent questions from Ethan brought moments of lightness and reflection to their days. Strengthening bonds within the family became their new focus.
We need to cherish these moments, David. Every little smile, every tiny milestone.
You're right, Sarah. It's these moments that will help us heal.
Together, they found solace in the small moments, building a new foundation of love and support that quietly sat in the background, a memory that would never fully disappear but had softened around the edges. They didn't speak about the events that had brought them together anymore. They didn't need to. The pain, the anger, it was still there. But muted, no longer controlling their lives. In its place there was acceptance, a quiet understanding that they had all been through something impossible, something life-changing. And they had survived. One evening, both families gathered for dinner at Emily and Michael's home. The air was warm, filled with the scent of home-cooked food, the hum of quiet conversation, and the occasional soft king from Oliver, who slept peacefully in his crib beside the dining table. The room was bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun, its soft light filtering through the curtains, casting a warm hue over everything. It felt like a scene from another time, something familiar and comforting, yet extraordinary in its own way. Emily set a dish on the table, smiling, as she glanced at Oliver, then at the others gathered around. "He's getting bigger every day," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet pride that had blossomed over the months. "He sure is," Sarah replied, her eyes never leaving the crib. "It's amazing to watch him grow. It feels like he was just born yesterday." Ethan and Ella sat side by side, their laughter and chatter filling the air as they planned their next adventure, a trip to the park, a new game, anything that let them escape into their childhood, where things were simple again. They were still kids after all, despite everything they had found a way to return to that innocence. Michael, watching the two families sit together, found himself exhaling a long-held breath. It hadn't been easy. It still wasn't in some ways, but seeing them all here, united around the table, he realized just how far they had come. David raised his glass slightly. Breaking the momentary silence to Oliver, he said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude for bringing us together in ways we never could have imagined. Everyone nodded, clinking their glasses together softly as if not to disturb the peaceful scene for a brief moment. There were no words, just the sounds of silverware gently clinking on plates, the soft murmur of conversation and the contented breathing of the baby beside them. Emily looked over at Sarah, her eyes welling up, but this time it wasn't with sorrow, it was with something deeper, understanding love. "We're a family now," she whispered more to herself than to anyone else. No matter what, Sarah reached over, taking Emily's hand in hers. "Yes," she replied, squeezing gently, "we are." As the evening drew to a close, the sun dipped lower behind the hills, casting long shadows across the yard. Ethan and Ella excused themselves to run outside one last time before bed, their laughter ringing out as they disappeared into the fading light. The adults sat quietly for a moment, listening to the sounds of their children, and Oliver, still asleep, stirred gently in his crib, as if reassured by the peace around him in that quiet. Emily glanced at Michael, who sat beside her. "We're going to be okay," she said softly, resting her head on his shoulder. Michael nodded, wrapping an arm around her. "Yeah!" He whispered, his eyes on the crib where their grandson slept. "We are." The past hadn't been forgotten and the future was still uncertain. But in that moment, as the two families sat together, they knew they had found something precious, a chance to rebuild, to heal and to love. And so, under the warm glow of the setting sun, with Oliver nestled safely in his crib, two families once divided sat together, united by a bond they never expected, but now couldn't imagine living without. Hey guys, what an intense and emotional story. Right, it really makes us think about how important it is for parents to be present and aware of what's going on in their children's lives. As parents, we sometimes feel like we're doing enough. But stories like this are a wake-up call. We need to talk to our kids, educate them, and make sure they know they can come to us about anything. It's easy to get caught up in our daily lives and miss the signs, but being attentive can make all the difference. What do you guys think about this situation? How would you handle it? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let's keep the conversation going, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into stories like this one. Stay safe, everyone.